Hi, I'm International Master John Watson. This is a new lecture series on how to construct an opening repertoire, both from Black's and White's point of view, with an emphasis on concepts and reasoning. There are many books and DVDs outlining repertoires, and in fact I've authored two very recently myself, but those two and most others are written for relatively advanced players. So in this series, I want to present some relatively simpler systems for use by the majority of ICC listeners who actually range from somewhat past the beginning stage all the way to the experienced intermediate or club player. So on the beginner side, you needn't know much at all to benefit from these lectures, but still, at a minimum, you should be used to the relative values of the pieces. You should be comfortable with the material implications of exchanges, and it would help very much to know some basic chess concepts such as file, diagonal, pin, fork, and so forth, and have some experience with them. You can refer to any elementary book or lecture to study these, and I would strongly recommend that you maybe even finish a book and play a little bit in order to be really familiar and be able to keep up with these lectures, which I'll be emphasizing very elementary aspects in them, but nevertheless it would be nice to have as good a background as possible. Now, as a teacher, when it comes to opening study, the most common complaints I hear from students are that A, they don't have time to memorize variations, or even the inclination or ability to memorize variations, and to keep up with the latest theory, and B, they want to know the ideas associated with an opening, not just masses of moves and variations, which they might not understand the purpose of anyway. Now, I'm not going to pretend that you can play openings expertly or on a grandmaster level without some memorization of specifics and a good deal of practice with those moves. But I do think that I can get you started with some straightforward variations that will serve you well, are easy to learn, and will allow you to improve by using them in practice without losing a bunch of games in the meantime. So to do that, I want to emphasize openings in which you can do well simply by getting a good feel for the typical strategies and the reasoning behind the opening, so that common sense will help keep you out of too much trouble. It's also important to know the most logical early move orders, as well as some typical tricks that you can use, and of course tricks that you can avoid. So more specifically, I want to show both a set of repertoires for White, which will use the major first moves, and a set of repertoires for Black, using a variety of defenses. You'll notice that White opening repertoires in general can be particularly difficult for the beginning and intermediate player because White has to take account of so many defensive setups by Black. Also, if you play any of the popular main lines, as your teachers often tell you to do, and I know this because I get students from other teachers who have taught them the openings that they play as professionals or as experienced tournament players, which are much too complex, and in that case you have to know how to answer all kinds of critical responses, often tactical ones, and you've doomed yourself again to a lot of memorization. On the other hand, if you play passively, just to avoid this kind of trouble, you'll find yourself on the defensive, and you probably won't even be learning that much about quality chess play. So in these repertoires as White, I want you to control the center with your first move. That's the first thing I want, namely by one of these moves. E4, you've seen that, or D4, and I'm just going to stick with these basic major first moves for repertoires, one at a time, obviously. Now, it's not as though you can't play other moves, like G3 with the idea of this, or maybe B3 with the idea of playing this move. But the problem with this kind of move is that, and in fact many books have been written about this kind of thing, some actually extremely long books, and books that are again aimed usually at fairly good players because they have the experience to be able to handle this kind of position. But generally it's too easy to lose too much territory to your opponent and really be cramped by what your opponent does. You have to be quite expert not to get into early trouble. This kind of thing where basically Black simply takes over the center and then if you aren't careful, all of a sudden he advances these pawns and cramps your pieces, and then you're already in trouble. Playing with less space is one of the hardest things to do in chess. And I should also mention that some great players, some world champions, have basically chosen never to play with too much less space. So they also feel it's more difficult to play with less space. So also, even when we turn to black repertoires, I'll be emphasizing lines that fight for some territorial control, even if not quite as much as what white has. So that's sort of the background. Now in this first lecture, so as not to leave behind the truly inexperienced players, I want to lay out some very elementary chess ideas that apply to the opening. Most of you have probably heard these dozens of times and will be bored by them. That's completely understandable, and if you've read a chess book or two, you can skip this part of, well, the rest of this lecture actually without much harm, and you can wait for the actual repertoires that I'll begin presenting next week. But for many of you, it's very important to explain, especially to novices and really near beginners, what some of the basic ideas are, and in particular why we can ignore so many legal moves when we are looking at openings and talking about what to play. So the first and most important aspect of every opening is control of the center. The central configuration determines where you can put your pieces and basically just how you can proceed with the game. So the four squares in the middle of the board, these four squares, they constitute the center. They're traditionally called the center. But other squares surrounding them, every other square surrounding them, constitutes an extended center. Those squares aren't as important in the opening. They're really as important in many middle games, but they're very important and they support the center. They tend to be pieces upon which you can put pawns to support the center, or pieces that are well placed and have more effect than on other squares. So that's called the extended center. So this let me clear this board out. One good reason for controlling the center, although not the only one, is that you can put your pieces on those squares or right next to them on the extended center squares. Why is that good? Because most pieces control more points from the central squares or even from the squares of the extended center than if they were placed on a non-central square, especially the side of the board. For example, let's imagine a knight in the center here, for example, and a lot of you already know that's a very effective square. It can control 8 other squares. It's a very aggressive piece, very effective and influential piece. Whereas if you put a knight on the side of the board, for example in the corner, then you'll find out you can only control 2 squares as opposed to those 8. And if you put a knight even on some other side of the board, you control 3 or 4 squares, in this case 3, and certainly not 8. So you can see that a knight's less effective on those squares. Similarly, a bishop in the center of the board will control a lot of squares, 13 in fact, as you can count. Quite a bit of influence there. And the closer it gets to the side of the board, the less it covers. In fact, if it's on the side of the board or on most other squares, in the corner for example, it will cover 7 squares. And that's true of other squares on the side of the board. So again, a big advantage to having that bishop in the center of the board. Another use of the word center is that when a player has his pawns on the central squares, you can say that those pawns are his pawn center. So if white has pawns on e4 and d5, say after these moves, then you can say that the white center consists of these 2 pawns. And you'll notice that a mobile pawn center like this can drive away the opponent's pieces. That's an advantage of a center. And after, for example, something like retreat here, then we can speak of the pawn on c4 as part of this center because of the supporting role it plays. So in this picture, let's make another move from black here. In this picture, we can say that white has an advanced center, and it controls more space. White controls more space, whereas black has a restricted center and controls less space. Notice how That center sort of cuts off his own pieces from developing. In white, it can develop more easily. Now, as it turns out, every major opening involves first moves that control squares in the center. For example, when white plays e4, controls that, controls that square, d5, and when white plays this move, it controls that square, e5, but also d4 because the queen protects it. So black also, all of black's main defenses also are concerned with controlling the center. For example, after this, you've all seen this move, which controls d4, and you've seen, for example, that after white controls two more center squares, black might control those same center squares, and white can control more squares. Everything's controlling center squares. Center is the obsession here. And for example, white can control another one. So you see that this standard old-fashioned opening, like modern ones, concerns both sides covering central squares, and that's what's important. If you look at other openings, of course, it's the same thing. For example, in the French defense, black covers that square, white constructs an ideal center, and black plays that square, that move which attacks this, but also controls d5. So that's the basic idea. The Sicilian defense looks like it's a little different because it moves a flank pawn, but that flank pawn covers a central square. And the next move black makes is probably going to be either here or here, covering that square, or here, covering d5. Okay. But books devoting hundreds and hundreds of pages to e4, for example, seldom, if ever, well, they never really, most of them never mention a move like h6 or a move like h5. And why is that? Well, because it's understood that these moves, while they obviously don't lose, don't have anything to do with the center. They don't even have an indirect bearing on the center. So against an irrelevant move like this, white usually plays that move. And this helps with central control, obviously, but it's also called an ideal center. So one way to see if these two pawns together are called an ideal center. One way to see if a move makes sense in the opening is to see whether it helps with central control, but also whether it establishes an ideal center. And the ideal center for black, by the way, would be something like, well, let's make an irrelevant move for white. And maybe another pretty irrelevant move. Something like this. That's an ideal center. Pawns abreast on the fourth rank in the center. Okay, so then the question is, let's get back to I don't know, one of these, is that the question is, do you have to bring out a piece with every move once you've established a center? And the answer is, well, if you're trying to establish an ideal center, maybe not. You can play a move that's a little slow and doesn't bring a piece out because you're intending to go there and establish an ideal center. Or an opening maybe you're more familiar with as a younger player would be this, which is the Gioco piano. You may recognize that. And white can play, instead of bringing a piece out or castling or something, white can play there with the idea of playing here, establishing an ideal center. In fact, that's kind of hard to stop. So maybe one more idea would be for black. White plays the bishop's opening, black counterattacks on e4, white defends it, and black plays this move. And he's going to play this move next and establish an ideal center. So that's one way of playing. But the other big idea that we see in chess is called development, which refers to moving pieces, not pawns, off of their initial squares and putting them in play. In fact, just counting the number of pieces you've moved is the simplest way of measuring development. But there are principles of development that hold most of the time. One thing you should do is get as many pieces developed as possible. And the other thing is to bring those pieces to active squares where they have good scope, and without subjecting them to attack, of course. And that's where having a big center comes in very handy. And in fact, another principle is that you coordinate your developed pieces with the center, usually by moving them towards the center, working with your pawns to control as many central squares as you can. And there are other considerations. For example, you should normally try to move the same piece as few times as possible, and you should be careful about bringing the queen out too early in the game. And the reason for that is she's sometimes subject to attack by a lesser piece, which means she has to retreat and lose time that could be used for the development of other pieces. At any rate, we'll see these principles play out in our repertoires. Sticking to elementary ideas, one of the most important things you can do in chess openings and middle games is to protect your king from harm. Sometimes it's not just beginners, but it's also advanced players that forget this or are too slow doing it and get in a lot of trouble. Now, as you probably know, the most common method for securing the king's safety is castling, and the goal of castling is usually to provide pawn cover for the king. So real quickly, let's show what pawn cover does. Here the white king is relatively sheltered and safe. You'll notice that black can't put pieces threatening white's king on any of those squares, and because they'll be taken. And even if black could take one of these pawns, there's two other protecting white's king. And black can't even check, say with a bishop or a queen, because this pawn blocks it off, and so it's quite difficult to get to the king. That's the idea. But black's uncastled king, it's a whole other story. A queen or a rook can attack it on that square or from that square. Bishops can attack from this square or this square, and knights can attack from all over the place by giving check. So obviously that king's very exposed if there are more pieces on the board, and it would have been nicer for him to have castled in most games. So you'll usually see some sort of castling going on. And of course there are many other considerations that apply to the opening as well as the middle game. And if you're a player starting out, you should know about some of them. This includes a whole variety of pawn structures, setups, which we can't cover right now, such as doubled pawns, isolated pawns, and backward pawns. And you should study those from general chess books if you get a chance. You probably own one of these books. Even beginners' books usually cover those concepts. And you should therefore understand the potential weaknesses that they sometimes create. These are not always bad things, but they can sometimes create. Now, one thing that doubled pawns, isolated pawns, and backward pawns tend to allow is an outpost. That's where a piece sits on an advanced square where it can't be driven away by enemy pawns. So, for example, here's this outpost. This knight is on an outpost on d5, and there are no pawns to chase it away. Now, on this case, this knight obviously goes to a lot. Well, it's in the center, so there's 8 squares it can go to. It can play defensively as well as offensively. Now, we might also talk about how, in this case, black can't even exchange off this knight for another piece because his bishop's on the wrong color. And that, in fact, is called a bad bishop because the bishop is restricted by its own central pawns. So it's difficult for that bishop to have any influence on the center or get to a central square. Now, if this bishop, imagine this bishop being here for a second, that's called a good bishop because it's on the opposite color of his own central pawns. It's on light squares, and you can see how that gives it a lot more scope to go to. Useful moves. It also allows it to go to a square like this and exchange off this knight, this powerful knight. So that's called a good bishop, and it's definitely, in most cases, a better kind of bishop to have. So let's return to the initial position. Now I want to talk about some general things without showing examples. And first of all, speaking of knights and bishops, I will talk about the bishop pair sometimes, or the two bishops in an opening position, which means having a pair of bishops when your opponent doesn't have a pair of bishops. For example, when your opponent has 2 knights, or when your opponent has a bishop and a knight. Now, in practically every stage of the game, opening, middle game, and ending, having 2 bishops on the board when your opponent doesn't have 2 bishops, has 2 knights or a bishop and a knight, more often than not constitutes a meaningful advantage. Not always, of course, but when I mention that one side has the bishop pair, I'm normally going to mean and use that to indicate that that side with the bishop pair has an advantage, at least in that respect. Now, of course, it might be overcome by other advantages, and in fact, often one side will work hard to get the bishop pair and be willing to give up some other disadvantage. But anyway, in many openings, one side or the other tries to get the advantage of having the bishop pair. And why are the 2 bishops an advantage? Well, for one thing, they cover squares of both colors. So you might think a bishop is a strong, powerful, long-range piece that should be better than a knight, which is very limited, and the bishop can attack from afar and the knight can't. But on the negative side, unlike a knight, a bishop can only work on one color. With two bishops, that disadvantage is corrected. And a final factor to mention is space, which simply means how much territory one side or the other controls. It's usually defined by advanced pawns, for example, or a pawn center, or maybe you have space on the wings and you have advanced pawns on the wings. For now, I'll just say that the side with more space has an advantage unless he has other concrete problems. For example, perhaps his opponent can destroy his center or destroy the side on which he has more space. The pawns there, usually by using his pawns to force exchanges. So anyway, that's an elementary list of factors, very simple factors that will partially explain at least why one side or another may have an advantage in the opening. I hope all of this hasn't been too boring and that the younger or less experienced players can use this lecture as a reference point and then go back to it when things go too fast. Although you'll find that things usually don't go too fast. I'll try and emphasize fairly elementary concepts, but you may not remember these. Anyway, the real fun is going to begin next week when we start to look at an actual repertoire for white. Thank you.